En avril 2016, en violation des lois internationales, le gouvernement israélien a refusé de renouveler le titre de voyage d'Omar Barghouti, qui se voit ainsi interdit de voyager et quasiment assigné à résidence. Dans le même temps, le ministre israélien du renseignement, Israël Katz, l'a menacé d'élimination civile ciblée, ce qui constitue, comme Amnesty International l'a confirmé, une menace d'assassinat ciblé. Quand nous l'avons sollicité en mai 2016 pour participer à cette conférence, BDS, non-violence et désobéissance civile, il a immédiatement donné son accord. Nous espérions tous que l'interdiction de circulation serait levée. Il n'en est rien. Israël mène sa guerre contre BDS par tous les moyens. C'est pourquoi il a tout spécialement enregistré pour ce soir cette vidéo d'une vingtaine de minutes et, pour témoigner de l'intérêt qu'il porte à cette initiative, et bravant l'interdiction israélienne, il nous a fait l'honneur et l'immense plaisir d'inaugurer la conférence et nous dire quelques mots via Skype. Nous l'en remercions chaleureusement.
Good evening. I'm glad to be with you today, albeit via video. I will talk about BDS for Palestinian rights, non-violence, and the charm of hope. South African Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu has once compared the West's showering of Israel's regime with unconditional military, political, and financial support to placing Israel on a pedestal above every other state. Many people are afraid to criticize Israel's policies, Tutu argues, because of the exceptionally intimidating methods used by Israel's lobby. BDS is effectively working to take Israel's regime of occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid off the pedestal, to be treated like every other state that commits similar crimes. Palestinian, Israeli, French, and other human rights defenders who are active in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement for Palestinian rights have experienced some of the worst forms of this bullying and intimidation that Desmond Tutu describes. We are unnerved by targeted civil assassination. We're unnerved by these mafia-like threats, especially given the fast descent of Israeli society into fanatic Jewish fundamentalism, extreme colonial racism, and unprecedented levels of incitement to racial violence against the indigenous Palestinians, and increasingly against our Israeli anti-colonial partners as well. We are unnerved, but we are most certainly undeterred. Human rights activists in France who support Palestinian rights know all too well about the extreme bullying and legal intimidation that have become a patent of Israel, its lobby, and its political partners in the French state. But despite the fact that France is today, after Israel, the world's capital of anti-Palestinian repression, supporters of Palestinian rights, like yourselves, have persevered and continued to grow our movement. On behalf of many Palestinians, I salute you. Defying the draconian French state repression, elected councils of Bondy and Ivry-sur-Seine have recently adopted BDS measures against Israeli companies that support the occupation and violations of human rights. Palestinians are deeply grateful to every activist, academic, artist, trade unionist, writer, student, and elected official who continues to stand for Palestinian rights by building strategic BDS campaigns and increasing the movement's impact in France under exceptionally harsh circumstances. You inspire us and give us hope. Ultimately, Israel is intent not just on colonizing our land, but also our minds, searing into our consciousness the futility of hope and the impossibility of resisting its hegemonic and unjust order. Hope, after all, can be contagious. Despite decades of Israel's dispossession, occupation, siege, and ethnic cleansing, Palestinians have not given up. We continue to resist oppression and to assert our quest for equal rights under international law. The BDS movement was established on 9 July 2005 with the launch of the BDS call by the absolute majority in Palestinian civil society in a non-violent response to Israel's extreme colonial violence and the failure of the United Nations, dominated by the US, to hold Israel accountable to international. BDS aims to achieve three basic rights without which the Palestinian people cannot exercise our inalienable right to self-determination. First, ending the 1967 occupation of all Arab lands, including East Jerusalem. Second, ending Israel's system of racial discrimination, which even the US State Department has criticized as a system of institutional, legal, and societal discrimination. And third, recognizing the UN stipulated right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes of origin from which they were forcibly displaced in the 1948 Nakba and ever since. These three basic rights correspond to the three main components of the Palestinian people. 38% of Palestinians live in Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. 12% are Palestinian citizens of the present-day Israel, and 50% are Palestinians in exile. Though launched in 2005, the BDS movement is deeply rooted in decades of Palestinian popular nonviolent resistance to settler colonialism. It is inspired and strongly influenced by the South African anti-apartheid movement and the US civil rights movement. Despite the obvious differences between Israel's regime of oppression and that of apartheid South Africa, the similarities are striking, as many Israeli and South African analysts today admit. Israel's regime of oppression against the Palestinian people may be a unique cocktail, but it is in part a more sophisticated, evolved, and brutal form of apartheid than its South African predecessor. South Africa's Speaker of Parliament, Baleka Mbete, has recently stated, quote, "Apartheid in South Africa was a picnic compared to what we have seen in the occupied Palestinian territories," end of quote. Anchored in the universal principles of human rights, the BDS movement has consistently and categorically opposed all forms of racism and racial discrimination, including anti-Arab racism, anti-Jewish racism, Islamophobia, anti-Black racism, and so on. One's identity, we believe, should never diminish or restrict one's entitlement to rights. BDS targets complicity, not identity. BDS is an inclusive movement that enjoys growing support among very diverse communities, including a growing number of Jewish Israeli BDS supporters who play a significant role in exposing Israel's regime of oppression and advocating for isolating it. Former Israeli Mossad chief Shabtai Shavit is convinced that BDS has become a critical challenge to Israel's system of injustice, while the former Prime Minister Ehud Barak admits that BDS is reaching a tipping point. Though BDS calls for boycott measures in the academic, cultural, military, and economic fields, its gradually growing economic impact is the main reason why Israel considers the movement a strategic threat to its entire system of injustice. A 2015 study by RAND, a think tank in the US, predicted that BDS may cost Israel in the coming 10 years between 1 and 2% of its GDP, that is between $28 and $56 billion in the coming 10 years. Weeks ago, more than 50 local councils across the Spanish state announced themselves Israeli apartheid-free zones. In September 2015, Veolia, the French corporate giant, became the first international company to end all its involvement in illegal Israeli operations, following an extensive 7-year BDS campaign that cost the company tenders around the world worth over $20 billion. This has triggered a domino effect, with companies like Orange and CRH also pulling out of Israel's economy earlier this year. Also in 2016, the United Methodist Church's pension fund divested from the top Israeli banks that financed the occupations. The second largest Dutch pension fund, PGGM, had divested in 2014 from the largest 5 Israeli banks as well. The Bahia region in Brazil has recently ended a contract with Mekorot, the Israeli apartheid water company, after a quick BDS campaign there. These developments in the economic field could not have transpired without years of academic and cultural boycott initiatives that have revealed Israel's brand to the world as one of occupation and colonial rule. Over 1,000 Black activists, artists, scholars, students, and organizations in the US and elsewhere have endorsed BDS. This includes Black Lives Matter. While earlier in 2015, almost 1,000 cultural figures in the UK signed a pledge to support the cultural boycott of Israel, following similar initiatives in Montreal, Canada, Ireland, and South Africa. Artists who have recently cancelled gigs in Tel Aviv include Thurston Moore and Lauryn Hill. Student governments at Stanford, UCLA, Berkeley, Northwestern, and many other US, Canadian, and UK universities have voted for various BDS measures, including divestment from companies involved in Israel's occupation. Academic associations in the US and elsewhere, and many student governments on Western campuses have endorsed BDS measures. It's important to reiterate that the academic and cultural boycott that Palestinians have called for within BDS is institutional. It does not target Israeli individuals, it targets Israeli institutions due to their proven complicity in Israel's violations of international law. It therefore does not infringe on academic or artistic freedom. Israel's brand, as a result of all this, has started to take a hit around the world, mainly due to academic, cultural, and church-based boycott and divestment developments. In the US in particular, Israel faces a steady erosion of its standing among minorities, women and young Americans, Jewish Americans included. A 2015 survey shows, for example, that 47% of the most educated and influential opinion elites in the Democratic Party viewed Israel as a, quote, racist state, and after being informed about BDS, 31% supported it. BDS alone cannot take credit for Israel's growing academic, cultural, and to an extent economic isolation. Israel's behavior itself takes a lot of credit for this. The 2015 election of Israel's most racist government ever has inadvertently amplified support for Palestinian rights and for BDS tactics to attain them. The BBC GlobeScan poll of international public opinion, for example, has consistently shown in the last few years Israel competing with North Korea in popularity around the world, including among Europe's largest nations. Other than passing racist laws in the Israeli parliament at an unprecedented rate and government ministers adopting unabashed far-right racism, just a few weeks ago, Israel's chief rabbi for the Sephardic community called for the ethnic cleansing of non-Jews from the land of Israel. Leading Israeli political and military figures are deeply concerned about Israel's descent into an abyss. Ehud Barak said Israel has been, quote, infected with the seeds of fascism, while the current Deputy Chief of Staff, Major General Yair Golan, has compared revolting trends in Israeli society today to pre-Holocaust Nazi Germany. Having lost many battles at the grassroots level, Israel has adopted a new top-down strategy since 2014 to replace its previous unsuccessful strategy of fighting BDS through branding and extensive propaganda. Evoking memories of McCarthyism, the new strategy employs legal warfare, espionage, and intensified propaganda to undermine or even outlaw BDS advocacy. This should deeply concern not just activists supporting Palestinian rights, but all those who value civil rights, especially progressive movements struggling for racial, gender, social, economic, indigenous, and environmental justice. The authoritarian measures adopted against BDS so far include the prosecution of BDS activists in France, including in Montpellier, proposals to exclude organizations that support BDS in the US from public funding or contracts, and the UK government's intimidation of local councils that have voted to support BDS measures. Glenn Greenwald has described this well-orchestrated series of draconian measures as the greatest threat to free speech in the West. But Israel's job is not easy. Drunk with impunity, thanks to US and European protection as well as massive military and economic support, Israel is arrogantly trying to delegitimize the boycott, a time-honored tactic of resisting injustice, and thus to suppress free speech. To achieve this goal, Israel is forging alliances with far-right forces around the world that are often openly anti-Semitic. By fostering a new McCarthyism in some circles in the US, France, the UK, and elsewhere, where criticism of its policies is met with severe punitive measures, Israel is further alienating the liberal mainstream, including Jewish liberals, and losing the future leadership of the West. In a major set of rights organizations such as Amnesty and the International Federation for Human Rights, as well as the US American Civil Liberties Union, have all defended the right to boycott Israel as a matter of freedom of speech. When asked about Israel's attempts to deny international BDS activists entry, the spokesman of the US State Department reiterated recently his government's opposition to BDS, but he added, quote, "We value freedom of expression even in cases where we do not agree with the political views espoused," end of quote. BDS addresses comprehensive Palestinian rights, not simply ending the Israeli occupation of some densely populated Palestinian territory in order to save Israel as a purer apartheid. Under international law, Israel is the state that bears responsibility for the occupation and other forms of injustice against the Palestinians. The BDS movement calls for boycotting Israel, not just the settlements, just as South Africa was the target of boycotts due to its apartheid regime. If our call for equal rights and freedom is regarded as a threat to Israel's existence, what does that say about Israel? But BDS is not a one-size-fits-all type of movement. As a decentralized human rights movement, BDS has its rights-based platform that all its partners agree on. But beyond that, when it comes to tactics and targeting, BDS adopts the principle of context sensitivity. This means that activists anywhere decide what to target, how to target it, and what kind of coalition they can build to achieve their goals. The four general criteria that the Palestinian BDS National Committee, the largest coalition in Palestinian civil society that leads the global BDS movement, recommends in selecting strategic BDS targets are: 1. The level of complicity, which means we focus on companies and products that are most clearly involved in Israeli human rights violations. 2. Intersectionality or cross-movement coalition building, which means prioritizing companies, products that enable the creation of broad cross-struggle alliances. Targeting the world's largest security company G4S, for instance, opens the door to building strong coalitions with refugee rights groups, blacks, Latinos, and so on and so forth, among other groups that are whose rights are trampled upon by G4S. Third criterion is potential for success. A BDS campaign should have a realistic chance of success beyond simply raising awareness. As human rights activists, we invest our time most effectively to achieve tangible results. We are a goal-oriented movement. The fourth and last criterion is media appeal. A target that helps to attract favorable media coverage also amplifies awareness raising. I discussed intersectionality. Allow me to explain a bit. Equality is the key to rights, the BDS movement believes, and it is therefore the sine qua non for real peace. The most profound human right is the right to have equal rights, irrespective of identity, as enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But to achieve equality, freedom and justice must be realized. Rights and justice movements all over the world keenly realize this fact. Our diverse struggles for economic, social, racial, gender, climate justice objectively share our common commitment to and passion for justice, for ending oppression, for attaining true equality and living in dignity. Our oppressors are more united than ever, and our oppressions are more intersectional than ever. It is high time for all of us to explore the intersectionality of our resistance in response, not in a quid pro quo form that is transactional and almost opportunistic, but in an organic way that recognizes the common ground and the critical need for common struggles. Divided, we fail. United, we prevail. What about anti-Semitism? Well, Israel's outrageous abuse of the anti-Semitism against all those who are against its policies or regime of oppression is losing its intimidation power. The anti-Semitism smear tactic does not work with Palestinians in particular. We are the victims of Zionism and its settler colonial project, who played no role in the Holocaust and should not be made to pay for it with our UN-stipulated rights. Moreover, claiming that boycotting Israel or exposing the inherent racism of the Zionist ideology is anti-Semitic is itself an anti-Semitic statement, as it equates Israel with all Jews, putting all Jews into one monolithic basket represented entirely by Israel. Anyone who denies Jewish diversity and who tries to put all Jewish persons into one basket is an anti-Semite. Israel is also activists who are joining the ranks of BDS. Jewish American support for BDS, for example, has skyrocketed in recent years, with one poll conducted in November 2014 by an Israel lobby group revealing that 46% of non-Orthodox Jewish American men under 40 support a full boycott of Israel. No wonder Jewish Voice for Peace is growing exponentially in the United States. Martin Luther King Jr. once said boycott is essentially withdrawing cooperation from an evil system. If you think about it, this is hardly an act of charity. It's a profound moral obligation to do no harm. We do not need constructive engagement with Israel to persuade it to become a nicer apartheid. We cannot accept any futile and ill-conceived attempts by supporters of Palestinian rights to mediate between the colonized Palestinians and the far-right Israeli parties that colonize and oppress us. Nor do we need lessons in conflict resolution, as ours is not a conflict between two equals, but a settler colonial situation involving oppressors and oppressed. If you are neutral in situations of injustice, Archbishop Desmond Tutu once said, you have chosen the side of the oppressor, regardless of your intentions. What the absolute majority of Palestinians is calling for is true solidarity, not charity. And solidarity today is spelled BDS. In conclusion, despite its massive military power, including nuclear weapons, its propaganda machine, and its patent intimidation of everyone who criticizes its regime of oppression, Israel has failed to defeat or even slow down the impressive growth of BDS. No power, after all, can crush an inclusive, non-violent movement for justice that thrives in people's hearts and minds across the world. As in the struggles for civil rights in the US and against apartheid in South Africa, no repression can extinguish the charm of well-founded hope. With your support and effective solidarity, we can take Israel's regime of apartheid and colonial oppression off the pedestal and carry on our struggle for freedom, justice, equality, and dignity. Thank you.